The environment in which humanitarian aid agencies work can be extremely insecure. Since the Second World War, and especially since the end of the Cold War, many fragile societies have broken down, and there has been an explosion of intensely violent, seemingly anarchic civil wars. These conflicts have seen a blurring of the distinction between crime and war, and a growing sense of unaccountability, where some have a vested interest in a permanent state of chaos.
The environment has become much more difficult, and that's partly because NGOs are now ready to go into areas that maybe a generation ago they would not have considered going into. We see more of these irregular wars, more of these more chaotic wars involving militia forces, involving organized crime, etc., in different parts of the world, which means that at a local level it can be much more hazardous for NGOs to operate.
Within these wars, civilians are increasingly affected, not as the accidental byproduct of conflict, but as its targets. At the close of the 20th century, 90% of the victims of war were civilian. At its start, they had made up only 10%. Aid agencies, mandated and driven to work with such civilian victims, find themselves in the eye of the storm, in the very heart of these zones of danger. As a result, a growing number of aid workers have died and been injured in the course of their humanitarian work in the field. But agencies have not only been caught in the crossfire, they have themselves been targeted.
People know that we are wealthy. We are perceived to be wealthy. We have high-profile vehicles, radios, cash, warehouses full of goodies. We are a target.
This is partly attributable to the types of programs we are running. Programs that may be seen as politically partisan to some involved in the conflict.
In the last 10 to 15 years, agencies have become much more conscious of the political element of their work and are using much more of a rhetoric of human rights and have become more explicit with their agenda. So I think that that has had a big impact in the way that NGOs are perceived by other actors in the field.
In short, aid agencies have become more vulnerable to insecurity, and this trend is seemingly set to continue. But the vulnerability of aid agencies has also been created by internal factors. In many cases, agencies themselves have had inadequate approaches to managing their security. In the late 90s, in response to the growing vulnerability of aid agencies, donors supported an inter-agency research program which led to the development of a new, broad-based concept of good management for security in aid agencies. This research revealed that the threats to which aid agencies are now exposed are far wider than the most obvious issues associated with working in war zones. For example, our staff, who are the bedrock of what we do, can also become a significant source of security threats. Due to poor recruitment and staff management processes, death threats, shootings and mob demonstrations have all occurred to aid agency staff. Therefore, it is essential that we take a broad view of security and how it can be achieved.
I don't really feel that what's termed traditional security approaches are appropriate for NGO or indeed agency field operations, because in actual fact you're not going to protect yourself militarily. You're not going to protect yourself from crime through the sort of traditional policing measures. It's actually got to come in from inside your own organisation. Almost the first thing to do is to get out of the mindset that this is in some way, in quotations, security and requires a security officer, and to understand that security is something which has to be built into the operation from before you go in and then mainstream throughout your activities. The traditional approach to security of hiring yourself an ex-police officer or an ex-army officer who understands how to liaise with people, well, there's a value there because there can be a lot of security meetings to go to and to be able to talk the jargon and understand it is useful, but it's not really appropriate to your own security needs because they come from your own management, from inside yourselves.
But even where agencies accept that security is a management responsibility, experience has shown that they tend to think too narrowly.
That manifests itself in practice in bunker yourself in, you know, a lot of site protection, security measures, high walls, barbed wires, barriers at the gate, screening at the gate. And so you bunker yourself in, and then you have all sorts of procedural rules to supposedly reduce your exposure to any risk. No-go zones, no-go times, convoy driving, all sorts of gadgetry in terms of radios and mobile phones and sophisticated coded language, which is in certain cases required and warranted, but it doesn't tell you very much, that sort of approach of why you would become vulnerable, why you would be possibly become a victim of a certain attack or a certain aggression. And also a major drawback is it cuts you off from your whole environment, your whole operating environment. You do not develop relationships with people as well, which might actually be beneficial in reducing a threat or in alerting you to a possible threat or in helping you solve a security incident after it has occurred. So there are limitations to that. I find that a fairly incomplete security concept. Aid agency security management should have a much more holistic approach.
Nearly everything an agency does in the course of its work in the field can have an impact on security. Agencies as a whole need to be security aware. They need to have a security culture, and all members of staff need to take some form of responsibility for their personal and organizational security.
Have you made sure that it is secured?
Yes, I have.
You're doing a good job.
Every organization, whether it's in the public or private sector, whether it's an NGO or part of government, the organization has a duty of care, and those with managerial responsibility should be told as part of their job description what their responsibilities are and should be given adequate training for it. But throughout that, every single member from the most junior staff, national and international, should take personal responsibility. And for the duration of their tour, on whatever the activity is, keep it uppermost in mind.
Everybody has a role to play in security management. And that has lots of different implications, one of which is, well, there's probably a lot of education to be done because most people wouldn't necessarily recognise that as a part of their job description. Because, of course, if you don't take security into account, you might not be on the ground as long as you want to, and your beneficiaries will suffer. So I think it's accepted now that it's a prerequisite to good programming.
Whoever is in charge of a programme in a country is ultimately responsible for the security of that programme and the staff and people and assets that are involved. People in those responsible managerial positions must take the issue of security very seriously and ensure that they do have the skills to be able to collect the information, analyse, produce the guidelines, implement and bring everybody along together as a team in doing so.
If we need to reconsider our notion of what security means and who is responsible, we also need to redefine what we mean by security skills, many of which most managers will find they already possess. At its most simple, this is just an awareness that we need to view the world through the lens of security. We need to think security.